Om Namo Baghavathe Shri Ramanaya. Hari Om. Last time we reflected on one of the Upadesa Sara slokas where it was said, self-abidance leads to self-knowledge. Atma samsthiti, or the abidance in the self, leads to knowledge of the self. Now, question arises as to how does one abides in the self? Why do we have this question? It is said self-abidance leads to the knowledge of the self. So the knowledge of the self is gained by self-abidance. But to abide in the self, you have to know what is self. So if you know what is self, then why do you need self-knowledge again? Because you already know. So it's like a chicken and egg story where this self-abidance, what is this self-abidance? Where does one get started? Is a question. So let's take this opportunity to reflect on that today, where we are trying to understand what is abidance, then how to abide in the self. First of all, one thing we need to keep in mind is self-abidance is neither a thought nor an action. I'll repeat it. Self-abidance is neither a thought nor an action. But yet, it is said self-abidance leads to self-knowledge. So if that's the case, how does one go about this in order to gain the self-knowledge, in order to know who we are? So as I said, let's try to understand what is abidance. Abiding in something, where we can substitute being something. So we abide in many things, meaning we try to be many things. So we become any of this. And why do we become any of this? We seek stability in that. Being a human being, being a Swami, being a male, being in a profession, etc. That being, we try to abide in it because it provides us stability. However, the stability provided by any of these doesn't last. The stability doesn't last because with time it changes, with circumstances and situations it changes. So therefore, we try to be many things. We abide in many things. In the traditional language, this is what is known as ego. I am this, I am this, I am this. So whenever I am saying I am this, I am this, I am being this, I am being that, etc. That is abiding in this or that. Now, the stability what we seek is the kind of stability which is permanent and everlasting. Now, what scriptures say is, abiding in the self will provide that. So, the question is how to abide in this self. So, what scripture says, instead of being this or that, we should seek stability in the self which is eternal, which is infinite. And how that is done is by giving up, seeking stability in the impermanent things. So, to put it another way, not abiding or giving up abiding in what is not self, that is whatever we call ourselves, I am this, that, etc. When we give up abiding in those things, when we give up using that as our reference, then that is what is known as not abiding in what is not self. When you cease abiding in what is not self, that is what is known as abidance in the self. So, in the name of abidance in the self, you don't do anything new. In the name of abidance of the self, what you should do or what you are supposed to do is to give up abiding in what is not self. So, whatever we are abiding in as this or that, when that ceases, abidance in the self begins. So, abidance in the self is not something you think or not something you do. Abidance in the self begins when you give up abiding in what is not self. So, how do we abide in what is not self? By thinking. By thinking and then try to put those thoughts into action. When those thoughts that I am so and so, I am this, and I have to be this, I have to become this, etc. When those thoughts are brought to an end, then abidance of the self begins. So, bottom line is, abiding in the self, as I said in the beginning, is not a thought or an action, but it is achieved by bringing to an end the process of abiding in what is not self. In order to achieve this only, there are many spiritual practices are given out in the traditional scriptures. Even Bhagavan Ramana Maharshi has given us so many guidances, like what we looked at in an earlier session, where he says, whenever a thought comes, which we looked at in the meditation series, whenever a thought comes, he asks us to inquire for whom this thought is and from where this thought is coming. So the purpose of for whom this thought is coming and from where this thought is coming, through that, what we are trying to achieve is, we are trying to bring the thoughts to an end, as we saw it in the meditation series. And when you bring the thoughts to an end, then that brings an end to abidance in what is not self. So that is the very whole purpose of meditation itself, where we try to become thoughtless. The whole purpose of becoming thoughtless is to bring to an end to the process of abidance in what is not self. That is, imagining myself as a finite entity in terms of body, mind and intellect, and anything associated with that. When the abidance in what is not self ceases, then abidance on the self happens. It is not something you do, it is not something you think. Actually, when you give up the thoughts, only it happens. The self, that is what you are, and you will start abiding in the self when you give up abiding in what you are not. So all the spiritual practices are designed to give up this abidance in what is not self. So when we take up any of the spiritual practices, whether it's meditation or whether it's the Vichara marg, as Bhagavan mentioned, the purpose of that, we have to understand, is to bring to an end to what? To abidance in what is not self. In the traditional language, abidance in what is not self is known as ego, ahankara. So that's why in the traditional language they say, when the ego ends, the self-knowledge shines by itself. So here, in the language what we are using right now, self-abidance begins when abiding in not self ceases. So how to abide in the self is by giving up abiding in what is not self. Om Namo Baghavathe Shri Ramanaya.